Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into a world where dinner could genuinely injure you, where breakfast was a warm mug of something vaguely alcoholic, and where the most sophisticated kitchen in the kingdom still had a rat problem. Tonight we are talking about medieval food, what it actually was, what it actually tasted like, and why, if you were dropped into the average medieval village at mealtime, you would probably take one sniff, turn around, and walk directly back into the time machine. You probably won't survive this, and honestly, neither did a lot of them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing that someone in New Zealand is drifting off to the sound of medieval peasants chewing rocks while someone in Canada is just getting into bed after a long day. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in a field somewhere in Northern Europe. The year is somewhere around 1150, give or take a few decades, and you are hungry. Not the kind of hungry where you check the fridge 3 times hoping something new has appeared. Genuinely, stomach-gnawing, lightheaded hungry. The harvest was 3 weeks ago, the winter stores are already starting to look a little thin, and tonight's meal is the same thing it was last night, and the night before that, and probably the night before that. It is bread. It is always bread. But not the bread you are thinking of. Not the soft, pillowy, golden-crusted loaf that you can tear apart with your hands and slather with butter. No, this bread is something else entirely, and it deserves its own slow, careful introduction, because in many ways, it is the foundation of everything you are about to learn about the medieval diet. The bread of the medieval peasant, and let us be clear, the vast majority of people in medieval Europe were peasants, was made from whatever grain happened to be available, which was rarely the good stuff. Wheat, the grain that produces that fine white flour you know and love, was expensive, difficult to grow in colder climates, and largely reserved for the upper classes. What most ordinary people had access to was rye, barley, oats, or some grim combination of all three, often mixed with legumes like peas or beans when times were tight, which they very frequently were. The result was a dense, dark, heavy loaf with a texture somewhere between a brick and a sponge that has been left out in the rain. And here is where the tooth-breaking reputation comes from, and it is not just a metaphor. Medieval grain processing, even when done with some care, was an imprecise business. The millstones used to grind grain were constantly shedding tiny fragments of themselves into the flour, and archaeological examination of medieval skeletal remains has found extraordinary levels of dental wear in ordinary working people, not from sugar, which was a luxury almost no one could afford, but from the literal grit and stone particles embedded in their daily bread. You ate your bread, and your bread ate your teeth, every single day, slowly, methodically, and without apology. Beyond the grit, there was another problem lurking in the grain, one that historians and medical researchers have spent considerable time examining, and that is the issue of ergot. Ergot is a fungus, a particularly nasty one, that grows on rye and other cereals in damp conditions, which describes Northern Europe for a significant portion of the year. When ergot-infected grain was milled and baked into bread and then consumed, the effects were vivid and horrifying. Ergot contains compounds that are chemically related to LSD and mass outbreaks of ergot poisoning, sometimes called St. Anthony's fire, caused entire communities to experience hallucinations, convulsions, a burning sensation in the limbs, and in severe cases, gangrene of the extremities. The skin would turn black, fingers and toes would dry up and fall off, and the whole experience was so terrifying and so inexplicable to medieval people that it was almost universally interpreted as divine punishment or demonic possession. There are historians who argue, with reasonable supporting evidence, that several famous episodes of medieval mass hysteria, including some of the witch trial panics, may have had ergot contamination at their root. People were not faking what they felt. They were eating poison and hallucinating, and nobody knew why. Historians still argue whether ergot poisoning can fully explain the dancing plagues and hysteria outbreaks of the medieval period, or whether those events had social and psychological components that go beyond contaminated grain. But the fact that ergot was present, widespread, and genuinely dangerous is not in doubt. So you have your bread. It is dark, it is dense, it is slightly gritty, and on a bad harvest year it might be quietly poisoning you. How do you eat it? Well, one of the more practical innovations of medieval cooking was the trencher, a thick, dense slab of bread, usually several days old, that served as both plate and edible vessel. You would pile your food on top of the trencher and eat from it, and at the end of the meal, the trencher itself, now soaked in gravy or pottage or whatever liquid had accumulated on it, would be eaten too or given to the dogs or distributed to the poor. The trencher is actually a rather elegant solution to several problems at once. No dishes to wash, no food wasted, no pottery needed, and it gave your teeth one more opportunity to fight something hard and unforgiving before bed. Now, the type of bread you ate was also a very loud social signal, and medieval people read it instantly. Fine white bread, called manchet in England, was the bread of the wealthy. It was made from sifted, refined wheat flour, it was soft, it was pale, and it announced to everyone in the room that you had money, status, and access to better grain. The further down the social ladder you went, the darker and coarser the bread became. At the very bottom were people eating bread made from ground peas, ground beans, or in genuine desperation, from ground acorns or tree bark mixed with whatever cereal could be scraped together. This is not a figure of speech. Famine bread made from non-grain ingredients because there was nothing else, appears in historical records across medieval Europe with grim regularity, particularly in the northern regions where growing seasons were short and the margin between a decent harvest and a catastrophic one was heartbreakingly thin. The grain itself, before it even became bread, had to pass through the mill, and this was not a simple or free process. In most of medieval Europe, the local lord owned the mill, and peasants were legally required to use it, and to pay for the privilege, usually in a portion of their grain. This system, known as mill suit or suit of mill, meant that even the act of turning your hard-grown grain into flour was subject to a tax. You grew it, you carried it to the mill, you watched a portion of it disappear into the lord's share, and then you carried the rest home to bake. Every step of making bread, from planting to grinding to baking, was embedded in a web of obligations and payments that quietly but persistently skimmed resources from the people who could least afford to lose them. The oven presented a similar problem. Not every household had one. Large stone or clay ovens were expensive to build and expensive to heat, and in many villages there was a communal oven, again often owned by the lord, where villagers would bring their shaped loaves to bake, again for a fee. The timing was communal and imprecise. You would bring your dough, wait your turn, and hope that the oven was the right temperature for your loaf, which it frequently was not. Overbaked bread was hard as a stone. Underbaked bread was a doughy, gummy catastrophe that sat in your stomach like wet clay. Medieval bakers, the professional ones who sold bread in towns, were subject to extraordinary regulation because the stakes were so high. The assize of bread, a law in medieval England that dates to the 13th century, tightly regulated the weight, price, and quality of bread sold commercially. Bakers who sold underweight loaves faced public humiliation, being dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf tied around their neck, or physical punishment. This is where the phrase baker's dozen comes from. Bakers would add a 13th loaf to every dozen sold as a safety margin against being accused of short measure. Even today, every time you get a little extra, you have a medieval bread panic to thank for it. The quality of grain, and therefore bread, fluctuated enormously with the harvest, and medieval harvests were terrifyingly unreliable by modern standards. A wet summer could devastate the grain crop. A dry spring could do the same. Late frosts, early frosts, floods, drought, plant disease, and insect infestations all lurked as constant threats, and when they struck hard. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 is the most dramatic example. A sustained period of catastrophic harvests across northern Europe caused by a sudden shift in climate, during which somewhere between 10 and 25% of the population of some regions simply starved to death. People ate their seed grain, which meant the next year's harvest was also ruined. They ate their draft animals, which meant fields couldn't be plowed. They ate things that were not technically food. And through all of it, the bread, what bread there was, got darker, coarser, stranger, and less nourishing, until for some people it simply stopped existing. But let us not spend all our time in the darkest corner of the granary. Because even in ordinary years, even in reasonably good times, there was something quietly remarkable about the way medieval people related to bread. It was sacred in a very literal sense. The Christian Eucharist, the central ritual of the dominant religion of medieval Europe, was performed with bread. Bread appeared in prayers, in blessings, in the rituals surrounding birth and death and harvest. To waste bread was not just economically foolish, it was something close to sinful. There are accounts of medieval people picking up dropped bread, kissing it, and making the sign of the cross before eating it anyway, dirt and all. The relationship between a medieval person and their daily bread was not casual or incidental. It was profound and intimate and tinged with genuine awe because they understood, in the bone-deep way that only people who have been truly hungry can understand, that this dense, gritty, tooth-wearing loaf was the difference between life and death. So you hold your piece of bread. It is heavier than you expected. It is darker than you are used to. There is something slightly sour about the smell, because most medieval bread was leavened with a sourdough-style starter rather than commercial yeast, which gives it a tang that is actually not unpleasant, a detail that modern sourdough enthusiasts would find rather vindicating. The crust is thick and hard. The inside is chewy and dense and only slightly warm because it was baked this morning and has been sitting since. You take a bite and you chew and you feel the slight grittiness between your molars, and somewhere in the back of your mind a small voice notes that you will be doing this 3 times a day, every day, for the rest of your life. Welcome to medieval dining. We are just getting started, and it only gets more interesting from here. The grain, the mill, the oven, the trencher, all of these are just the bones of a diet that was far more complex and far more varied than the popular image of medieval people gnawing on turkey legs and drinking from wooden cups suggests. And yet, at its core, bread was the anchor of everything. It was caloric when calories were scarce. It was filling when there was nothing else to fill you. It was the baseline below which hunger began, and above which everything else was, in some sense, a luxury. Even the wealthy ate bread, their elegant, pale, soft manchet loaves, at every meal. The difference was what they ate alongside it, and that is a story for the next long stretch of this quiet evening. For now, settle in and imagine that weight in your hands, the rough texture against your fingers, the dark, slightly sour smell. The knowledge that this is supper and breakfast and tomorrow's supper too, and that somewhere out in the dark field just beyond the village, next year's grain is already taking shape in the soil, and whether it will be enough is a question that none of you can answer yet. The bread is in your hand, and the fire is low, and somewhere above the hearth, suspended on an iron hook or balanced on a trivet of questionable stability, there is a pot. There is always a pot. In the medieval peasant household, the pot is perhaps the single most important object in the entire dwelling. More important than the furniture, most of which is a bench and a table and a straw mattress on a dirt floor, and arguably more important than the roof, which leaks. The pot is life. The pot is dinner. The pot is, in a very real and only slightly disturbing sense, the same dinner it was last week, because one of the defining features of medieval peasant cooking is that the pot never entirely empties, and it very rarely entirely cools. What you are smelling right now, standing in this low-ceilinged, smoke-filled room with the fire crackling and the wind pushing through the gaps in the walls, is pottage. And pottage deserves its own long, unhurried conversation, because it is at once the most boring and the most fascinating food in the entire medieval world. The word pottage comes from the old French word for pot, potage, and it means, in its simplest definition, anything cooked in a pot with water. This is a definition so broad as to be nearly meaningless, and that is precisely the point. Pottage was not a recipe. It was a method. It was a philosophy. It was the answer to the question that every medieval cook faced every single day, which was, what do I have and how do I make it edible? Whatever the answer, oats, barley, dried peas, leeks, turnips, a handful of dried herbs, a scrap of salt pork if you were lucky, a bone if you were slightly less lucky, nothing but grain and water if you were not lucky at all. You put it in the pot, you added water, and you let it cook. For a long time, for a very, very long time, the result was a thick, porridge-like substance that ranged from something genuinely nourishing and even tasty, in good seasons with good ingredients, to something closer to warm paste, in lean times when there was almost nothing to put in it. Modern food historians who have attempted to recreate period pottage recipes from surviving manuscripts report results that vary enormously. A pottage made with good barley, fresh leeks, a handful of dried peas, and a ham bone simmered for a few hours is actually quite pleasant, thick and savory and filling in a way that makes sense, a kind of medieval vegetable soup that a modern diner would not find entirely alien. A pottage made with nothing but oats and water and a pinch of salt, which is closer to what many people were eating for much of the year, is something else, bland and gluey and deeply philosophically gray. The perpetual pot, the one that never fully emptied, was not a universal practice, but it was common enough to be worth examining closely, because it represents a fascinating intersection of practicality and what we would today consider a fairly serious food safety concern. The idea was simple enough. You kept the fire going, you kept adding ingredients as they became available, and you skimmed the top occasionally to remove whatever floated up that you did not want to eat. Fuel was expensive and gathering firewood was labor-intensive, so a fire that never quite went out was an economic necessity as much as a culinary choice. If the pot was always hot, the fire was always alive, and if the fire was always alive, you were warmer, safer from wild animals and bandits, and always one ladle away from something that was at least technically dinner. The food safety implications of this system are, to modern eyes, somewhat alarming. A pot that is never fully emptied and never fully cooled is, by contemporary food science standards, a bacterial incubation chamber of impressive ambition. Medieval people, of course, had no concept of bacteria. They had no germ theory, no understanding of contamination, no thermometers to check whether the liquid in the pot was actually hot enough to kill pathogens. What they had was fire and observation. If the pot was simmering, it felt safe, and for the most part, the high temperatures of active cooking did keep the worst biological hazards at bay. But for the most part is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and historians still argue whether the perpetual pot was a genuine health hazard or whether the near-constant heat made it safer than it sounds. The honest answer is probably. It depended enormously on the season, the temperature of the room, and how carefully the cook managed the fire overnight. What went into the pottage day by day and week by week was largely determined by the agricultural calendar and by social position. For the very poor, the pot might contain little more than grain and water for months at a stretch, with the occasional addition of foraged greens, nettles, dandelion leaves, sorrel, wild garlic, that added nutrition and flavor without costing anything. This practice of foraging wild plants to supplement the diet was widespread and important, and medieval people were far more botanically literate than most of us are today. They knew which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous, and which were in that unsettling middle category of plants that were somewhat toxic but edible if prepared correctly, boiled multiple times, soaked in water, dried and ground, because hunger is a powerful motivator for culinary experimentation. For people slightly higher on the economic ladder, a prosperous peasant farmer, say, or an artisan in a town, the pottage might include dried legumes like peas, beans, and lentils with some regularity. Legumes were the great nutritional workhorses of the medieval diet, providing protein at a time when protein from animal sources was expensive and often unavailable. A pottage of dried peas with some onions and a bit of fat was genuinely nutritious by any reasonable standard, and the medieval instinct to pair grain with legumes, bread and pea soup, oat pottage with beans, was, without anyone knowing the biochemistry, an excellent protein complementing strategy. The amino acids that grain lacks, legumes tend to provide. Medieval peasants stumbled into something nutritionally smart through sheer necessity and centuries of accumulated practical knowledge. The herbs that went into pottage were also more sophisticated than the image of crude medieval cooking might suggest. Parsley, sage, thyme, and hyssop were all commonly grown in cottage gardens and commonly added to the pot, both for flavor and for their perceived medicinal properties, because in a world without modern medicine, the line between food and medicine was blurry at best and non-existent at worst. You seasoned your pottage with herbs partly because it tasted better, and partly because certain herbs were understood to aid digestion, warm the blood, balance the humors, or ward off disease. The theoretical framework was wrong. Humoral medicine, the dominant medical paradigm of the medieval period, is not supported by modern science, but many of the specific herbal recommendations it generated were not entirely without basis. Thyme, for instance, has genuine antimicrobial properties. Sage has antioxidant compounds. The fact that medieval herbalists recommended them for reasons that make no scientific sense does not change the fact that they were, in some cases, providing real benefits. Salt deserves its own paragraph in any discussion of medieval pottage, because salt was to medieval cooking what electricity is to modern cooking, the invisible infrastructure without which almost nothing worked properly. Salt preserved food. Salt drew water out of vegetables and meat to prevent spoilage. Salt made bland, starchy food palatable. And salt was expensive, controlled, taxed, and in some regions extremely difficult to obtain. The salt tax, gabelle in France, was one of the most hated and persistent forms of medieval and early modern taxation, and salt smuggling was a serious criminal enterprise with a serious criminal underworld attached to it. To season your pottage generously with salt was, in some times and places, a display of modest wealth. To eat unsalted pottage was to eat food that tasted of almost nothing, and to do it every day was a kind of gray sensory poverty that sat on top of all the other kinds. Now, one of the quirkier aspects of pottage culture, and this is the kind of detail that tends to stick, is the evidence for what might be called flavor monotony as a genuinely documented psychological experience. Medieval writers, mostly monks and scholars writing in Latin, occasionally note the spiritual virtue of eating plain, unvarying food without complaint. The monastic diet, which was often deliberately austere, included pottage as a staple precisely because it was humble and unchallenging and did not excite the passions. One 12th century monastic text suggests that a monk who looks forward to dinner with excessive eagerness is already halfway to gluttony, and that the virtue of pottage lies precisely in the fact that it offers the body what it needs and the soul nothing to get excited about. There is something almost meditative about this framing, the perpetual pot as a spiritual exercise in detachment, though we might suspect that the monks who wrote these texts were perhaps not spending a lot of time eating nothing but oat paste in January. Beyond the monastery, the pottage pot also served as a community object in ways that are touching when you slow down to think about them. In villages where resources were shared out of necessity, a sick neighbor might receive a pot of pottage from a healthier household. A family in mourning after a death might find their doorstep visited by neighbors bearing food, almost always pottage, warm and heavy and practical. Celebrations like baptisms and betrothals might see the community pottage enriched with extra ingredients, a shared feast made from everyone's small contribution to the pot. The communal meal was not just a social event. It was a demonstration of solidarity, a redistribution of resources, and a way of keeping the weakest members of the community from falling below the floor of subsistence. Medieval villages were not kind by nature. They were kind by necessity, and there is a difference, but the kindness was real. There is a nursery rhyme, you probably know it actually, that goes, "Peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot 9 days old." You have heard it as a children's rhyme, probably bounced to it as a hand-clapping game at some point in your life, and there is a reasonable chance you never stopped to think about what it was actually describing. Peas porridge is exactly what it sounds like, a pottage of dried peas, and the 9 days old detail is not poetic license. It is a description of exactly the perpetual pot we have been talking about. Medieval and early modern households really did keep pottage going for days at a stretch, eating from it as it aged and thickened and changed character, adding to it as new ingredients became available, and that rhyme, bounced cheerfully between the palms of children for centuries, is a small, perfect piece of culinary history embedded in a nursery song. The pottage of the wealthy was a different creature entirely, and it is worth spending a moment there to illustrate the contrast. In aristocratic and royal kitchens, the word pottage was applied to a much more elaborate class of dish, thick stews enriched with meat, spiced heavily with imported spices, colored artificially with saffron or sandalwood, and served in elaborate presentations that had as much to do with display as with nourishment. A rich pottage might contain venison, wine, ginger, cinnamon, sugar, and a thickener made from ground almonds, and it would arrive at the table in a gilded bowl looking something like a savory pudding of extreme ambition. The word was the same. The dish was barely recognizable as the same category of food. This gap between what the word pottage meant to a peasant and what it meant to a lord is itself a kind of summary of the entire medieval food system, in which the same vocabulary described experiences so different as to belong to almost entirely separate worlds. And yet, both the peasant at the smoky hearth and the lord at the gilded table were eating their pottage from a bowl or a hollowed piece of bread, with a spoon if they had one, and with their fingers if they did not. Cutlery in the medieval period was limited and personal. Forks were known but deeply unfashionable, a Byzantine affectation, considered effeminate by many medieval Europeans, and not commonly used at table until the Renaissance. Knives were carried by almost everyone and used for everything from cutting food to cutting rope to cutting people, because the medieval pocket knife was also the medieval self-defense tool. But the spoon, the humble, ancient, uncomplicated spoon, was the eating utensil of choice for anything liquid, which, given how much of the medieval diet consisted of some form of wet grain or wet vegetable mush, meant it was basically the primary eating utensil of the entire civilization. So you take your spoon, wooden, probably carved from a single piece of wood and worn smooth from years of use, and you dip it into the pot and you bring up a thick, steaming ladle of pottage and you blow on it carefully and you eat. It is warm. It is filling in the way that starchy food is filling, a heaviness that sits comfortably in the stomach and tells the body that it is safe to rest now. If it is a good day, there is a flavor there, something savory and herby and faintly leguminous. That is not unpleasant. If it is a difficult month, it is paste and you eat the paste and you are grateful for it and you reach for the bread and you are grateful for that too. Outside, the night is cold and the wind is moving through the thatch, and the fire is burning low because you cannot afford to burn it high all night, and the pot is still warm above the embers, and tomorrow morning you will stir it, add some water, maybe throw in a handful of dried oats, and it will become breakfast. And then lunch. And then, with a little luck, something new will come along. A bit of salt fish, a turnip from the root cellar, a scrap of something traded at the market, and the pot will change just slightly, and that will be, in the honest economy of a medieval palate, a very good day indeed. The pot is still warm behind you, and the bread is still gritty between your teeth, and if you have been paying attention you might have noticed that neither of those things involved very much meat. That is not an accident. That is the reality of medieval protein economics, and it is one of the most persistent myths about the medieval period that people were constantly gnawing on enormous roasted joints of something while mead flowed freely and jesters capered in the corner. That image comes almost entirely from depictions of aristocratic feasting, and we will get to those, but first we need to spend some time in the much more common reality, which is that for most medieval people, meat was a rare and precious thing, obtained with difficulty, preserved with questionable success, and consumed with a gratitude that we, standing in front of a refrigerated meat counter with 47 options available at 2 in the morning, are genuinely not equipped to understand. Let us start with the question of who actually ate meat regularly, because the answer is more complicated than a simple rich versus poor divide, though that divide was absolutely real and absolutely stark. At the top of the social hierarchy, the nobility and the clergy ate meat with impressive frequency. Multiple times a day at grand tables, a rotating selection of game, poultry, and domestic animals that was limited more by season and availability than by cost. Below them, prosperous merchants and skilled artisans in towns might eat meat several times a week, particularly in the form of salted or preserved meats that were affordable in small quantities. Further down still, the prosperous peasant farmer might eat fresh meat a handful of times a year, at slaughter season in late autumn, at major feast days like Christmas and Easter, and perhaps on a few other occasions that warranted something special. At the very bottom, the landless laborer, the cottager with almost no land and no animals, might go for months without tasting anything that had recently been alive and warm. The primary domestic meat animals of medieval Europe were pigs, cattle, sheep, and goats, and of these the pig occupied a special and rather affectionate position in the peasant household, for very practical reasons. Pigs were efficient. They ate almost anything, kitchen scraps, acorns, roots, garbage, and converted it into meat at a rate that other domestic animals could not match. They did not need to be kept alive over winter to provide ongoing value the way a dairy cow did, because they provided no milk and were not used for draft work. They existed to become food, and they did so enthusiastically and without excessive resource expenditure, which made them the ideal peasant animal. The autumn pig slaughter was a significant event in the agricultural calendar, a combination of practical butchery and community celebration, and virtually every part of the pig was used with a thoroughness that would impress even the most committed modern nose-to-tail chef. The flesh became salt pork and bacon. The fat became lard for cooking. The blood became blood sausage. The intestines became sausage casings. The feet, the ears, the snout, the tail, all of it went into something. The squeal, as the saying went, was the only thing you wasted. But here is where we arrive at the preservation problem, and it is a significant one. Without refrigeration, keeping meat edible for any meaningful length of time required one of a limited number of techniques, all of which worked imperfectly and some of which introduced their own problems. Salting was the most common method, rubbing the meat heavily with salt, sometimes combined with saltpeter, and storing it in barrels or hanging it in the smoky upper reaches of the cottage where the fire's smoke acted as an additional preservative. Smoking added flavor and helped prevent mold, but it also dried the meat into something that required serious effort to render palatable. Heavily salted meat was intensely, almost aggressively salty, to a degree that modern palates would find difficult, and it required long soaking in fresh water before cooking to bring it back to something edible. Dried meat, jerked, basically, though medieval Europe did not use that term, was another option, as was potting in fat, a technique in which cooked meat was packed tightly into a container and sealed with a layer of rendered fat to exclude air. None of these methods was foolproof. Salt quality varied. Temperatures fluctuated. Storage conditions were often far from ideal. And the result, fairly frequently, was meat that had gone at least partially bad by the time it reached the table. Not dramatically rotten, necessarily, not the kind of Greenford catastrophe you are picturing, but off in the way that old preserved meat goes off, sour, rancid, funky, with a smell that announced itself before the dish arrived. This is the context in which the famous spice as rot massacre theory enters the conversation, and it deserves careful handling, because it is one of those ideas that has been repeated so often it feels like established fact but is actually considerably more contested than it first appears. The theory goes like this. Medieval people used enormous quantities of expensive imported spices: pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, primarily to mask the taste and smell of meat that had gone bad. It is a satisfyingly logical explanation, and it fits neatly into the popular image of medieval life as a constant struggle against decay and spoilage. There is just one significant problem with it, which is that the evidence does not really support it as the primary explanation. Historians still argue whether the spice as rot massacre theory is accurate, or whether it is a retrospective assumption that modern people have imposed on medieval cooking because it confirms our image of the period as fundamentally gross and desperate. The counter-argument, which has gained considerable traction among food historians in recent decades, points out several things. First, spices were extraordinarily expensive, pepper was sometimes used as currency, and the spice trade was one of the primary economic engines of the medieval world, and people who spent that kind of money on flavoring were not necessarily the same people who were eating questionable meat. The wealthy, who used the most spices, also had the best access to fresh meat, the best storage conditions, and the best stocked larders. If they were using spices to mask spoilage, they were doing it in a roundabout and economically bizarre way when they could simply have not served bad meat. Second, surviving medieval recipe manuscripts, the famous ones like the Fermi of Curry, the Viandier of Taillevent, or the various Italian and German cookbooks that have come down to us, show that spices were used in quantities and in combinations that suggest genuine aesthetic preference rather than desperation. You do not carefully calibrate the ratio of ginger to cinnamon to create a specific flavor profile if your goal is simply to drown out a smell. Third, and perhaps most simply, bad meat smells. Heavily spiced bad meat smells like heavily spiced bad meat. The spices do not actually fix the problem. They just give the problem a more interesting aroma. What the spices were more likely doing, at least in part, was signaling wealth and sophistication, satisfying a genuine medieval preference for complex, multi-layered flavors, and providing what was understood as medicinal benefit in a framework where diet and health were deeply intertwined. But we will spend more time with spices in their own section later on, so let us set them gently aside for now and return to the question of what the meat actually tasted like when it arrived at the table. Fresh meat, when it was available, was generally prepared in one of two ways: roasted on a spit over an open fire or boiled. Roasting was the prestigious method, the one associated with feast days and important meals, because it required a large, consistent fire and someone, usually a small child or a low-status servant, to turn the spit continuously for hours, basting the meat with its own dripping fat and whatever flavorings the cook chose to apply. The result, when done well, was genuinely excellent. A whole pig or a haunch of venison properly roasted over a wood fire, basted and turned and cooked slowly, is a magnificent thing, and medieval cooks who had access to good fuel and good ingredients produced food that would hold up well against modern standards. Boiling was more practical for everyday cooking, and boiled meat in a pottage or broth was the form in which most ordinary people encountered animal protein on the relatively rare occasions they encountered it at all. Now, we should spend a moment on the category of animals that medieval people ate that might surprise you, because the medieval concept of which creatures were appropriate dinner was considerably more expansive than the modern Western one. Swans were eaten, and not just eaten but specifically reserved for the royal table in England, protected by law so that their regal presence on the banquet platter could not be democratized. Peacocks were eaten, though often cooked and then redressed in their own feathers for presentation purposes, which is a theatrical commitment to food styling that we will revisit at the feast table. Herons, cranes, seagulls, and a remarkable variety of other birds appeared in medieval recipe books with instructions for their preparation, which ranged from perfectly sensible to ambitious. Porpoises and whales, when they washed up on shore or were caught, were classified as fish for the purposes of fasting regulations. More on that particular theological maneuver later, and appeared in royal and aristocratic kitchens with some regularity. Here is a quirky one: beavers. Medieval theologians, in a feat of motivated reasoning that deserves genuine appreciation, declared that the beaver's tail was fish, not meat, on the grounds that it was scaly and lived in water. This meant that beaver tail could be eaten on the many days of the year when meat was prohibited by the church. The rest of the beaver was unambiguously meat and therefore off-limits on fast days. But the tail was legally, theologically, ecclesiastically a fish. You had to admire the commitment. Similar logic was applied to barnacle geese, based on a persistent medieval belief that they hatched from barnacles and were therefore more fish than fowl, and therefore edible during Lent. The natural history was completely wrong, but the culinary loophole was extremely convenient, and it was exploited enthusiastically. Rabbits presented a similar case. Baby rabbits, called lorises, the newborn, still hairless young, were also sometimes classified as not quite meat by medieval authorities, on the grounds that they had not yet fully transitioned from their aquatic environment in the womb. This argument required a certain amount of not looking too closely at basic mammalian biology, but when the alternative was going without protein during Lent, theological flexibility had a way of asserting itself. The hunting of wild game added another layer to the meat economy, one that was also heavily stratified by social class. Deer, boar, and other large game were typically the exclusive property of the nobility, protected by forest laws that could be brutally enforced. Poaching, taking game from the lord's forest without permission, was a serious crime with serious consequences, ranging from heavy fines to mutilation to death, depending on the period and the jurisdiction. And yet poaching happened constantly, because hunger is a more powerful motivator than fear of punishment, and the records of medieval courts are full of cases involving ordinary people caught with stolen venison or illegally snared rabbits. The rabbit, in fact, was a particularly fraught animal in medieval England, not native to Britain but introduced by the Normans as a managed food source, kept in elaborate warrened enclosures called pillow mounds, and officially the property of whoever owned the land they lived on. A wild rabbit seen running across a peasant's field was, technically, not available to that peasant regardless of how hungry they were. Whether the peasant accepted this legal reality is another matter. Smaller animals, pigeons, sparrows, starlings, thrushes, were more accessible to ordinary people, and bird trapping and snaring was a widespread practice. Dovecots, the towers or niches built to house domestic pigeons, were another lord's privilege in many regions, but wild birds were somewhat harder to regulate, and a skilled trapper with a net and some patience could add meaningful protein to the diet without attracting the attention of the forest wardens. Fish, similarly, were important. We will encounter them again in the fasting section, and freshwater fish from rivers and ponds were theoretically available to anyone with a line, though again, the best fishing grounds were frequently owned or controlled by the nobility or the church. So your piece of meat, if you have it, is hard-earned in every sense. It may be salted, which means it has been soaking since yesterday to draw some of the brine out, and it is now boiling in the pottage pot with the leeks and the barley. Or it is a small bird, plucked and gutted with practiced hands, threaded onto a stick and held over the fire by the youngest child, who is turning it with the focused attention of someone who knows that if they let it burn they will be in serious trouble. Or it is a slice of bacon, a dense, intensely salty strip of preserved pork fat and meat, fried in the pan with some onions until the fat renders out and the whole cottage smells like something that is, regardless of everything else we have said tonight, genuinely delicious. Because here is the thing, and it is important to remember this as we move through a story that could easily become a litany of grimness. Medieval people were not indifferent to flavor. They were not eating badly because they didn't care. They were eating what they had, and within the constraints of what they had, they cooked with real skill and real care and real pleasure. The woman standing over the fire adjusting the position of the pot, adding a handful of thyme from the bunch hanging to dry by the door, tasting the broth and adding a pinch more salt. She is doing something her grandmother taught her, and her grandmother's grandmother before that, a continuous thread of practical culinary knowledge passed hand to hand across centuries. The fact that she is working with difficult ingredients under difficult conditions does not make her any less of a cook. It might, in some ways, make her more of one. The cottage fire is behind you now, and the smell of salt pork and thyme fades as you step into a different world entirely. A world of torchlight and tapestries, of tables groaning under the weight of dishes you cannot quite identify, of music drifting from a gallery above and the sound of 100 voices talking at once in the echoing stone hall of a medieval castle. You have been invited, through some miracle of social circumstance, to a feast, and the first thing you notice, even before the food, is that everything here is a performance. The food is theater. The meal is a political statement. The act of eating, in this context, has almost nothing to do with hunger and almost everything to do with power, hierarchy, identity, and the careful, elaborate business of telling everyone in the room exactly who you are and exactly how important that is. The medieval feast, the great banquet of the aristocratic hall, is one of those historical phenomena that has been thoroughly romanticized by popular culture and yet somehow remains more extraordinary than the romanticized version, because the reality, when you look at it closely, is so magnificently strange that fiction would struggle to invent it. We are talking about meals that lasted 4 hours. Meals with dozens of courses. Meals at which live birds were released from baked pies, not as a joke but as a genuine presentation flourish, the medieval equivalent of a theatrical reveal, designed to produce gasps of amazement from the assembled guests. Meals at which the centerpiece was a roasted peacock reassembled in its own iridescent plumage, positioned to look alive, occasionally with a wick inserted into its beak and set alight so that it appeared, briefly and improbably, to breathe fire. Let us begin with the structure of the feast because it is not what you might expect. The word course, as we use it today, starter, main, dessert, does not quite map onto the medieval feast structure, which was organized around what were called services or removes, and which followed a logic that was as much symbolic and medical as it was culinary. Medieval dietary theory, rooted in ancient Greek humoral medicine filtered through Arabic scholarship and repackaged by European university physicians, held very specific views about the proper order in which foods should be consumed. Light, easily digestible foods, salads, thin broths, fruits, should open the stomach at the beginning of the meal. Heavy, substantial foods, roasted meats, thick pottages, should fill the middle, when the digestive fire was at its height. Sweet, warming, spiced foods should close the meal, to aid digestion and seal the stomach against the cold. This is why the medieval feast typically ended with what was called the void, a final service of spiced wines, candied spices called comfits, and small sweet confections that were intended to be medicinal as much as pleasurable, and which were sometimes consumed standing in a different room from where the main meal had taken place. Hence the term void, as in vacate, as in everyone move along and make room for the servants to clear up. The seating arrangement at a medieval feast was not incidental. It was a precise social map, and everyone in the room read it instantly and completely. The high table, elevated on a dais at one end of the hall, was where the host and the most important guests sat, facing the room, visible to everyone, their status announced by their position as clearly as if they were wearing signs. The further from the high table you sat, the lower your status, and the worse your food, because dishes were served from the high table outward, and by the time they reached the lower end of the hall they had been somewhat depleted by the more important diners who had taken their portion first. The salt was placed on the table, in an elaborate, expensive salt cellar, because salt cellars were status objects of genuine craftsmanship, and your position relative to the salt was another precise social signal. To sit above the salt was to be a person of consequence. To sit below the salt was to be a lesser guest, a dependent, a servant eating at the edge of polite company. This is where the phrase below the salt comes from, and it was not a metaphor. It was a literal description of where you sat and what that meant. The food that arrived at the high table was, by any standard, spectacular in its ambition. Mainstream historical records from medieval royal feasts, and they do survive in sometimes extraordinary detail because medieval households kept meticulous accounts, describe meals of staggering variety and complexity. A feast hosted by Richard II of England in 1387 reportedly fed 10,000 people over several days and required the labor of hundreds of kitchen staff working continuously. The household accounts of great nobles record purchases of spices by the pound and the hundredweight, of wine by the barrel, of game by the cartload, of exotic imported ingredients that had traveled thousands of miles to reach the English or French or German table. A single feast might include roasted peacock, stuffed suckling pig, whole roasted swans, elaborate fish dishes, vegetable pottages enriched with almonds and spices, delicate pastries filled with sweetened cheese or fruit, sugar sculptures called subtleties that depicted religious scenes or heraldic symbols and were as much artwork as food, and multiple varieties of wine served alongside ale and spiced drinks called hippocras and claret. The subtlety deserves a longer look, because it is one of the more remarkable intersections of medieval art and food. A subtlety, sometimes spelled subtility, from the Latin subtilitas, meaning something refined and clever, was an elaborate sculptural construction made primarily from sugar paste, sometimes combined with almond paste or wax, molded and painted and assembled into scenes of considerable complexity and sometimes considerable size. Subtleties were not primarily meant to be eaten, though they could be. They were meant to be looked at, admired, discussed, and understood as symbolic statements. A subtlety depicting the coronation of the Virgin Mary at a feast hosted by a bishop was a theological statement about the host's piety. A subtlety showing a lion defeating a dragon at an English royal feast was a political statement about power. They were edible propaganda, sugar-spun ideology, and the medieval sugar sculptor, a specialist craft distinct from the ordinary pastry cook, was a person of real skill and some prestige. The famous roasted peacock, reassembled in its own feathers after cooking, represents the same impulse taken to its natural extreme. The bird was skinned carefully before roasting, the skin and feathers set aside intact, and then after the flesh was cooked it was recovered in its own spectacular plumage and brought to the table looking for all the world like a living creature merely resting on the platter. Sometimes gilding, actual gold leaf, was applied to the beak and claws. Sometimes, as mentioned, a wick was threaded through the beak and set alight. The result was a dish that was, from a purely gastronomic standpoint, not actually very good because peacock meat is tough, dry, and not particularly flavorful. But nobody was eating the peacock for the flavor. They were eating it, or more accurately, displaying it, for exactly what it communicated: that the host had access to a protected bird of royal prestige, that the kitchen had the skill and artistry to prepare it this elaborately, and that this was the kind of table at which magnificent, impossible, slightly absurd things happened as a matter of course. The pies filled with live birds, most famously referenced in the nursery rhyme about 24 blackbirds baked in a pie, were another expression of this showmanship. The pie crust was baked empty as a hollow shell, a coffin in medieval terminology, which sounds alarming but simply meant an enclosure, and live birds were placed inside just before service. When the crust was cut open at the table, the birds flew out into the hall, to the delight and shrieking astonishment of the assembled guests. The actual food at the feast was a separate pie altogether. The bird pie was pure entertainment, a medieval party trick executed with a pastry crust and a handful of confused starlings. Historians still argue whether these entertainments were as common as the literary references suggest, or whether they were rare enough to be noteworthy precisely because they were exceptional. But the fact that they happened at all is both charming and faintly chaotic in a way that makes medieval feasting feel genuinely alive. The question of how much the food actually tasted good, separate from its visual and symbolic qualities, is an interesting one. The answer is, it depended enormously on the dish and the kitchen. Great medieval kitchens, the royal and aristocratic establishments with trained professional cooks, access to the best ingredients, and the resources to execute complex recipes, produced food that surviving manuscripts suggest was genuinely delicious by any standard. A dish of chicken roasted with ginger, verjuice, and a sauce made from ground almonds and spiced wine, prepared by a skilled medieval cook with good ingredients, would not be out of place in a modern restaurant with a medieval-inspired menu and aspirations toward authenticity. The flavor profiles were different from what we are used to, heavier on sweet-savory combinations, heavier on warming spices, lighter on the sharp acidity that modern Western cooking often favors, but they were coherent and intentional and represented a sophisticated culinary tradition with centuries of accumulated technique behind it. What they were not, necessarily, was nutritious in the way that we understand nutrition. The aristocratic diet, for all its variety and richness, had its own deficiencies. The emphasis on meat, white bread, and rich sauces, combined with a relative scarcity of fresh vegetables, which were associated in medieval dietary thinking with the lower classes and with digestive weakness, meant that wealthy medieval people suffered from their own set of nutritional problems. Gout, caused by elevated uric acid from a diet high in purines found in meat and alcohol, was so strongly associated with the wealthy that it was called the disease of kings. Scurvy, from vitamin C deficiency, could affect people at all social levels depending on season and diet. Obesity, in a world where most people were chronically underfed, was a mark of prosperity, the visible bodily demonstration that you could afford to eat more than you needed, and was not generally considered a health problem. A fat lord was a successful lord. The servants who cooked and served this food occupied a fascinating middle space. In a great household, the kitchen was an enormous, complex, hierarchical operation with a clear chain of command that would not look entirely unfamiliar to a modern restaurant brigade. At the top was the master cook or chef, a person of genuine skill and sometimes considerable social standing, who commanded the overall direction of the kitchen and bore responsibility for the quality and safety of what went to the Lord's table. Below them were specialist cooks for roasting, boiling, saucing, and pastry, each with their own station and their own skills. Below them were the scullions and kitchen boys who did the grunt work, hauling water, tending fires, turning spits, scrubbing pots, in conditions that were hot, smoky, dangerous, and exhausting. Kitchen fires were a constant hazard. Burns were occupational inevitabilities. The working life of a kitchen servant in a great medieval household was genuinely brutal, and the food they produced for others bore almost no resemblance to what they themselves were eating at the end of their shift. The meals of great households also involved elaborate rituals of service that were themselves a form of theater. The Lord's food was tasted before it was served, by a designated taster, officially to check for poison, though poison was probably less common a threat than the elaborate ritual suggested. Every dish was brought in procession, announced, and set before the appropriate person in the appropriate order. Napkins were an absolute requirement. Hand washing was performed at the table, with ewers of scented water brought by servants at appropriate intervals. Remember that forks were not in use, and fingers were heavily involved in eating, so hygiene at the feast table was both genuinely necessary and ceremonially significant. The carver, the person who cut the meat at the high table, was a specific and honored role requiring skill, precision, and a vocabulary of specialized terms for breaking down different birds and animals that filled entire sections of medieval courtesy manuals. To carve a swan was different from carving a heron, which was different from dismembering a crab, and the correct terminology for each was something that a well-educated young nobleman was expected to know, alongside Latin, horsemanship, and the rules of heraldry. So you sit at your place in this great hall, somewhere in the middle distance from the high table, close enough to see the peacock in its feathers, far enough that the subtlety has already been largely demolished by more important diners by the time it reaches you, and you eat. The trencher before you is thick and dry, and the servants ladle onto it a portion of something dark and richly spiced, and the music plays on above you, and somewhere down the hall a dog is being expelled from under a table, and the candles in their iron holders throw moving shadows up the stone walls, and for a moment, despite everything, despite the smoke and the noise and the salt and the grit and all the complex machinery of hierarchy and display that surrounds this meal, it is genuinely, simply rather wonderful. The candles are burning lower in the great hall, and the feast is winding toward its close, and someone near the high table has called for more wine, and that call will be answered immediately and without question because in the medieval world, the call for more wine is never a call that goes unanswered. You have been eating for the better part of 3 hours, your trencher is dark with the accumulated drippings of several courses, and you are beginning to feel the specific heavy warmth of a medieval evening in full swing. Not just from the food, but from what you have been drinking alongside it, which has been considerable and which has been almost certainly alcoholic. Because in medieval Europe, the question was not whether you drank alcohol. The question was what kind, how much, and whether you were wealthy enough to have options. Let us start with the most important fact about medieval drinking, the one that reframes everything else. Water was dangerous. Not metaphorically dangerous, not occasionally dangerous, but genuinely, consistently, and often fatally dangerous, particularly in towns and densely populated areas where the relationship between the water supply and the sewage system was, to put it diplomatically, inadequately considered. Medieval urban water came from rivers, wells, and conduits that were all too frequently contaminated with animal waste, human waste, industrial runoff from tanners and dyers and butchers, and the general biological consequence of crowding large numbers of people and animals into a small space without anything resembling modern sanitation. Drinking untreated water from a medieval urban source was a reliable way to encounter dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and a rotating cast of intestinal parasites that would make your life memorable in the worst possible way. Medieval people knew, at some practical level, that certain water sources were safer than others. Fast-running streams were generally understood to be better than stagnant pools. Spring water was preferred to river water in many regions, and water used for drinking was sometimes boiled in the process of making pottage or ale, but they had no germ theory to explain why, and their instincts did not always protect them. What did protect them, to a meaningful extent, was the widespread consumption of fermented beverages, because the fermentation process kills many of the pathogens that make water dangerous, and the alcohol content of even weak ale provides additional antimicrobial protection. This is not to say that medieval people understood this biochemically. They did not. They drank ale because it tasted better than bad water, because it provided calories, because it was socially embedded in the fabric of daily life, and because the people who drank it seemed to fare better than those who relied heavily on contaminated water sources, which was an observation that did not require germ theory to make. Ale, not beer in the strict medieval sense, because beer contains hops and hops were not widely used in England until the 15th century, making the hop drink a relatively late medieval innovation, was the default beverage of medieval England and much of Northern Europe. It was brewed from malted grain, usually barley, mixed with water and fermented with wild or cultivated yeast, and it came in a wide range of strengths from the very weak, sometimes called small ale, to considerably stronger varieties that would produce a noticeable effect if consumed in quantity, which it frequently was. Small ale, with an alcohol content of perhaps 1 to 2%, was genuinely the breakfast drink of choice for men, women, and children alike, consumed in large quantities throughout the day as a source of calories, hydration, and mild sociability. The idea of giving children alcohol for breakfast sounds alarming through modern ears, but small ale was considerably safer than the available water, considerably more caloric than plain water for children who were often chronically underfed, and considerably less intoxicating than the stronger varieties that adults consumed in the evening. The brewing of ale was, for much of the medieval period, primarily a domestic activity performed by women. The alewife, a figure who appears in medieval literature and legal records with considerable frequency, was the woman who brewed ale for her household and often for sale to neighbors and travelers. The ale stake, a long pole hung outside a dwelling to indicate that ale was available for purchase, was one of the most recognizable signs of medieval commercial life, and the alehouses that grew up around this trade were among the most important social institutions of the medieval village and town. This is where people gathered, gossiped, argued, made deals, heard news, and occasionally got into fights. The alehouse was the medieval pub, and like the modern pub, it was simultaneously a place of community and a place of occasional chaos, and the local ale was the social lubricant that made both possible. The quality of medieval ale varied dramatically, and here we encounter another medieval food regulation story that illuminates how seriously communities took the business of what they drank. The assize of ale, a companion piece of legislation to the assize of bread we mentioned earlier, regulated the price and quality of ale sold commercially, and women found selling adulterated or underweight ale faced punishments that ranged from fines to the ducking stool, being strapped to a chair and plunged into cold water in public, a humiliation that served as both punishment and entertainment for the assembled crowd. The specific adulterations that alewives were accused of included adding water to weaken the ale, using grain of poor quality, or adding various substances to mask the taste of bad brewing, some of which were considerably more alarming than others. Medieval ale could be flavored with a mixture of herbs called grut, typically including bog myrtle, yarrow, and wild rosemary, before hops became dominant, and some of the plants in the grut mixture had mildly psychoactive properties that added an interesting dimension to the drinking experience beyond simple alcohol. Wine occupied a completely different social and symbolic space from ale, and the distinction was stark and immediately legible to everyone in medieval society. Wine was the drink of the wealthy, the educated, the southern, and the ecclesiastically important. In a theological sense, wine was irreplaceable, the Eucharist required wine, and the Church was the single largest consumer and producer of wine in medieval Europe, maintaining vineyards across the continent with the focused dedication of an institution that understood its supply chain as a matter of spiritual necessity. Monasteries produced wine not just for their own consumption and religious use, but as a significant source of income, and monastic winemaking contributed meaningfully to the development of European viticulture, including some traditions that survive to the present day. For the secular wealthy, wine was both a dietary staple and a status symbol, imported at considerable expense from wine-producing regions in France, Germany, Spain, and Italy to the colder northern countries that could not reliably grow grapes. English wine, yes, medieval England did produce wine, in a climate that was somewhat warmer than today's during the medieval warm period, was generally considered inferior to French imports, and the wine trade between England and Gascony was one of the most economically significant commercial relationships of the medieval period. The taste of medieval wine would be unfamiliar to modern palates in several respects. Wines were often young and poorly stabilized, prone to turning to vinegar within months of production, and were frequently mixed with honey, spices, and other additions to improve or mask the flavor. Hippocras, a spiced wine drink that appears constantly in medieval feast records, was made by steeping wine with a mixture of spices, typically cinnamon, ginger, and pepper, and sweetening it with honey or sugar, producing a mulled wine-adjacent drink that was simultaneously a beverage and a digestive medicine. Wine was also routinely watered down, a practice that was not considered adulteration but rather good sense and good medicine. Undiluted wine was considered too heating and too stimulating for regular consumption, and the classical tradition of mixing wine with water was maintained throughout the medieval period. The ratio varied by occasion and by the individual's constitution, as understood through the lens of humoral medicine, and a physician might genuinely prescribe a specific dilution ratio for a patient as part of their treatment. Water used to dilute wine was itself rendered safer by the contact with alcohol, which was an accidental but real benefit of the practice. At the very top of the medieval beverage hierarchy sat a collection of exotic and expensive drinks that appear in feast records and in the accounts of wealthy households as special occasion treats. Vernage and Malmsey were sweet, rich wines from the Mediterranean that commanded extraordinary prices in northern markets. Mead, made from fermented honey and water, was ancient and prestigious and appeared at important celebrations. Cider and perry, fermented apple and pear juice, were regional specialties in areas where orchards were plentiful, offering a locally produced alternative to ale that could approach wine in its complexity and strength. And there was something called meth eglin, a spiced mead that occupied a particularly interesting space as both celebratory drink and herbal medicine, flavored with combinations of herbs and spices that were chosen as much for their perceived health properties as for their flavor. Now, a quirky footnote that belongs in any honest account of medieval drinking. There is good evidence that medieval people were not, despite consuming alcohol more or less continuously throughout the day, constantly drunk in the way that modern people sometimes imagine. Small ale was genuinely weak. It was consumed with food. It was consumed in a body accustomed to it from childhood. The alcohol content of everyday drinking was low enough that a healthy adult going about their normal work would not have been meaningfully impaired by it, and the image of the perpetually tipsy medieval peasant wobbling through their agricultural duties is mostly a retrospective fantasy. That said, feast days, celebrations, and the stronger Alesh and wines available in alehouses and great halls did produce genuine intoxication, and medieval literature is full of cheerful and occasionally alarming accounts of what happened when people drank the strong stuff in quantity. The moralists disapproved. The church issued periodic warnings. The people continued drinking anyway because they always do. The monastery had its own drinking culture that deserves a brief visit, both because it is interesting in itself and because it represents one of the more charming contradictions of medieval life. Monastic rules like the Rule of St. Benedict specified a daily allowance of wine or ale for monks. Benedict's rule suggested about a hemina of wine per day, which translates to roughly half a pint, though interpretations varied and some monasteries were considerably more generous in their reading of the text. Monks who were sick were entitled to more. Monks engaged in heavy labor were sometimes granted extra. The theoretical framework was moderation and necessity. The practical reality, in some monasteries, apparently strayed some distance from the theoretical ideal. Medieval monastic records include accounts of abbots scolding their communities for excessive drinking with a frequency that suggests the problem was persistent and the scolding only intermittently effective. There is one more beverage that belongs in this conversation, and it is one that often surprises people when they encounter it in the medieval context. Milk. You might expect milk to be a common medieval drink, given the presence of dairy animals throughout medieval Europe, but in practice it was consumed much less than you might think. Milk was primarily used for making cheese and butter, both of which preserved the nutritional value of milk in a form that lasted considerably longer than the raw liquid. Fresh milk soured quickly without refrigeration, and in the quantities available from a typical peasant household's single cow or small number of goats, it was more valuable as the raw material for preserved dairy products than as a direct beverage. Children drank more of it than adults. There is some evidence that lactose tolerance was more widespread in northern European populations in the medieval period, an interesting case of culture driving biology, but it was not the daily staple that modern people raised on dairy advertising might assume. So your cup tonight is refilled with something appropriate to your station: ale if you are in the middle of the hall, wine if you are closer to the high table, a small cup of spiced hippocras if you are very fortunate or the host is feeling particularly generous. The liquid is warm, slightly sweet, complex with spice, and it sits in your stomach alongside the roasted meat and the spiced pottage and the thick bread, and the warmth of it spreads slowly outward from the center of your chest. And the hall is full of noise and light and the smell of tallow candles and wood smoke, and outside the castle walls the night is cold and dark and the wind is moving across fields that will need to be planted in the spring, and you take another sip and you let the warmth do its work, and you think that perhaps, on balance, tonight is not such a bad thing to be a part of after all. The cup is still warm in your hands, and the spiced wine is doing its quiet, comfortable work. And somewhere in the flavor, that particular combination of cinnamon and ginger and the faint heat of pepper at the back of the throat, there is an entire world of commerce and obsession and human ambition that stretches from this candlelit hall all the way to the markets of Alexandria and the pepper gardens of the Malabar coast. The spices in your cup did not arrive here easily. They did not arrive cheaply. They arrived at the end of a journey so long, so complicated, and so expensive that the pepper sitting in its little dish at the high table represents, in a very real sense, the accumulated labor of dozens of people across thousands of miles of land and sea, each of whom took their cut, added their markup, and passed the precious cargo along to the next set of hands. By the time pepper reached a medieval English kitchen, it had passed through the hands of Indian farmers, Arab traders, Egyptian merchants, Venetian middlemen, and English importers, and the price at each stage of that journey reflected both the genuine cost of transportation and the enormous profit margins available to anyone who controlled a choke point in the chain. To understand the medieval spice trade is to understand one of the most powerful economic engines of the pre-modern world, and to understand why spices mattered so much to medieval people is to step inside a mental world in which flavor, medicine, status, and theology were not separate categories but aspects of a single, unified understanding of how the world worked and what it meant to live well in it. Spices were not a luxury in the way that a modern luxury item is a luxury, something pleasant but fundamentally unnecessary. In the medieval framework, spices were necessary. They were medically necessary, socially necessary, and in some contexts spiritually necessary, and the fortune spent acquiring them reflected a genuine, deeply held belief in their importance that went far beyond simple culinary preference. The medical case for spices rested on the humoral system, which understood the human body as a balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each associated with qualities of hot, cold, wet, and dry. Health was balance. Disease was imbalance. Food, including spices, could shift the humoral balance in one direction or another, and a skilled physician prescribed dietary adjustments, including specific spices, as a primary medical intervention. Pepper was hot and dry, making it useful for counteracting cold and wet conditions like excess phlegm. Ginger was similarly warming. Cinnamon was considered particularly beneficial for the heart and digestion. Nutmeg was recommended for a variety of complaints ranging from flatulence to liver problems. Sugar, yes, sugar was a spice in the medieval taxonomy. Grouped with the imported aromatics rather than with ordinary sweeteners, was considered a medicine first and a flavoring second, prescribed for respiratory complaints and digestive weakness and recommended for the sick and the elderly as a restorative. To season your food heavily with these substances was not just to make it taste good. It was to actively maintain your health, to keep your humors in balance, to demonstrate that you took seriously the responsibility of caring for your body in accordance with the best available medical knowledge. The social dimension of spices was equally important and equally explicit. Spices were expensive, visibly and obviously expensive, in a way that the host of a feast could deploy as a direct statement of wealth and sophistication. A sauce heavily laden with ginger and cinnamon and saffron, the dried stigmas of the crocus flower, which required extraordinary labor to harvest and was pound for pound one of the most expensive substances in the medieval world. Announced to every diner at the table that the host could afford the best, had access to the best, and wanted everyone to know it. The color that saffron gave to food, a deep golden yellow, was itself considered prestigious and beautiful, and medieval recipes sometimes call for saffron in quantities that seem almost aggressive by modern standards, producing dishes of an intense, uniform gold that must have gleamed in the firelight like something nearly edible. Pepper deserves special attention because it was, by volume, the most traded spice in the medieval world, and its economic and cultural significance was extraordinary. Black pepper came primarily from the Malabar coast of southwestern India, a region that is today part of the state of Kerala, and it had been a trade commodity between India and the Mediterranean world since antiquity. By the medieval period, it was the single most important commodity in the luxury trade, the benchmark against which other expensive goods were measured, and the thing that European merchants most desperately wanted and most reliably could not get enough of. Pepper was used as currency, as we mentioned earlier. Rents and ransoms were sometimes paid in it, and the term peppercorn rent, which today means a nominal or trivially small payment, originally referred to a payment made in actual peppercorns, which were anything but trivial. A pound of pepper in medieval England cost roughly the equivalent of several days' wages for a skilled laborer. A peppercorn, a single dried berry, was worth something. This is a fact that takes a moment to properly absorb. The route that spices traveled from their origins in South and Southeast Asia to their eventual destination in European kitchens was long, complex, and controlled at various points by various intermediaries who all profited from the transaction. The broad outlines were relatively fixed for most of the medieval period. Spices moved by sea and overland from their production regions to the ports of the Indian Ocean trade network, thence to the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, thence overland or by river to the markets of the Levant, Alexandria, Beirut, Antioch, where they were purchased by Italian merchants, principally Venetians and Genoese, who carried them by sea to the ports of Western Europe and from there distributed them northward to England, France, the Germanic territories, and Scandinavia. At each stage, the price increased. At each stage, some of the cargo was lost to accident, theft, spoilage, or the various hazards of medieval transportation. And at each stage, the merchants who controlled the route grew wealthy in proportion to how completely they could monopolize it. Venice's extraordinary prosperity in the medieval and early Renaissance period was built substantially on its control of the western end of the spice trade. The Venetians were ferociously protective of their position as the primary intermediaries between the Levantine markets and the hungry consumers of northern Europe, and they used their commercial and diplomatic relationships with the powers of the eastern Mediterranean, including, controversially, with Muslim powers that other European states were simultaneously fighting crusades against, to maintain their advantage. The tension between commercial interest and religious ideology in the spice trade is one of the more fascinating threads of medieval economic history, and the pragmatic way in which Venetian merchants navigated it, trading with the enemy during the Crusades while simultaneously financing crusading expeditions, tells you a great deal about the medieval relationship between faith and money. Now, let us return to the question we raised in the meat section because it belongs here as much as there. Did medieval people really use spices to mask the taste of rotten meat, or is that a myth? Historians still argue whether this explanation reflects actual medieval practice or represents a retrospective assumption by modern commentators who could not imagine another reason for the extraordinary expense of heavily spiced food. The case against the masking theory, as we touched on earlier, is substantial. The people who used the most spices were the people with the best access to fresh, high-quality ingredients. The spice combinations in surviving recipe manuscripts show evidence of genuine aesthetic calculation, not desperation. And frankly, heavily spiced rotten meat is still rotten meat, and medieval people had noses. The more nuanced answer is probably this: spices were used for many reasons simultaneously, and the masking of off flavors in preserved meat. Not dramatically rotten meat, but the slightly rancid, overly salty, funky character of imperfectly preserved protein may have been one of those reasons without being the primary one. A heavily spiced sauce over a piece of salt pork that has been soaking for 24 hours but is still a bit more aggressively salty and funky than ideal does benefit from the distraction of ginger and cinnamon. This is not the same as covering up catastrophic decay. It is what any competent cook does with imperfect ingredients. Not hide the problem, but work around it with additional flavors that complement what is good and draw attention away from what is less good. That is not deception. That is cooking. The peculiar and rather wonderful quirk of medieval spice culture is the absolute conviction, held by virtually everyone from the highest physician to the humblest herbalist, that certain spices came from paradise. Literally paradise, the Garden of Eden, imagined as a real physical place located somewhere in the distant east, from which rivers flowed outward carrying the aromatic substances that washed up in the markets of Alexandria and the ports of the Levant. Cinnamon, in particular, was associated in medieval cosmography with the rivers of Eden, and the belief that it grew in proximity to the earthly paradise gave it a spiritual charge that went beyond its medical and culinary value. To eat cinnamon was, in some sense, to taste something that had its origins in a sacred geography. This is a remarkable thing to believe about a piece of tree bark, but the medieval world was one in which the boundaries between the material and the spiritual were porous and negotiable in ways that are difficult to fully inhabit from a modern perspective. There is also the magnificent medieval legend of the cinnamon bird, the cynomolgus, a creature variously described as resembling a phoenix or a large eagle, which supposedly built its nest from cinnamon sticks in the trees of Arabia or India. The only way to obtain cinnamon, according to this story, was to lure the bird away from its nest with heavy chunks of meat, which it would carry back to the nest, causing it to collapse under the weight and scatter its precious cinnamon contents to the ground below, where collectors waited to gather them. This is complete nonsense, of course. Cinnamon is the dried inner bark of a specific tree, harvested by skilled bark peelers in Sri Lanka and southern India, but it is glorious nonsense, and it circulated in respectable medieval natural histories and encyclopedias with perfect seriousness, passed from author to author across centuries without anyone apparently stopping to say, "Hang on, has anyone actually seen one of these birds?" The legend served a commercial purpose too, because merchants who controlled the early stages of the spice supply chain had every incentive to make the origins of their products as mysterious and inaccessible as possible, discouraging competitors from attempting to go directly to the source. The search for a direct route to the spice-producing regions of Asia, bypassing the Venetian and Arab intermediaries who controlled the overland and near-sea routes and claimed their enormous cuts, was one of the primary motivating forces behind the age of exploration that began in the late 15th century. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and found his way to the Indian Ocean trading ports, he was not primarily motivated by the spirit of adventure or the desire to expand human geographical knowledge, though those things were present. He was motivated by pepper, by ginger, by cinnamon, by the staggering commercial advantage available to any power that could reach the source of the spice supply directly, without going through Venice. Columbus, sailing west rather than east, was also looking for the Spice Islands, and when he arrived in the Caribbean he spent considerable energy trying to identify the local plants as equivalents of the Asian spices he was seeking, because that was what the whole enterprise was for. The discovery of the Americas was, from one angle, a navigation error that occurred in the context of a quest for pepper. The world was changed by the spice trade in ways that medieval merchants, clutching their precious cargoes and calculating their margins in the markets of Venice and Bruges, could not have imagined and did not intend. Back in the hall, the spiced wine is nearly finished, and the comfits are being passed. Those small, hard-shelled candies made from seeds or nuts coated in successive layers of sugar syrup, flavored with anise or caraway or ginger, the medieval breath freshener and digestive aid rolled into one small, crunchy package. You take one and hold it on your tongue for a moment, letting the sugar shell dissolve slowly into sweetness, and then the ginger hits, warm and clean and sharp, and underneath it the specific complexity of something that has traveled a very long way to reach this moment, this hall, this tongue. Somewhere in the distance, on the other side of the world, someone is harvesting ginger root from the dark soil of a field you will never see, in a country whose name you would not recognize, under a sky that looks nothing like the one visible through the arrow slits above your head. And the thing they are harvesting will, through a chain of hands and ships and markets and negotiations and markups, eventually become this small warm sensation in your mouth, and neither of you will ever know the other existed. That, in its quiet way, is the medieval spice trade. And it is one of the most human things about the medieval world, this reaching across impossible distances for flavor. The comfort is still dissolving on your tongue, sweet and warming, and the hall is beginning to empty as the evening draws toward its close, and somewhere in the rhythm of this particular day, the bread at dawn, the pottage at midday, the feast in the evening, there is a structure that you have been following without quite realizing it, a structure imposed not just by hunger and habit but by a force considerably more authoritative than either. The church has been at your table all day. It has been there at every meal, not as a guest but as a legislator, and its influence on what medieval people ate, when they ate it, how they prepared it, and what they felt about eating it at all is so pervasive and so fundamental that to tell the story of medieval food without spending serious time in the shadow of the cathedral is to tell only half the story, and the less interesting half at that. The medieval Catholic Church's relationship with food was complicated, theologically rich, and practically enormous in its consequences. On one hand, the Church recognized eating as a basic human necessity and a potential source of legitimate pleasure. Food was a gift of God. The body required sustenance, and the sharing of meals was embedded in the most sacred narratives of the faith. From the Last Supper to the miracle of the loaves and fishes to the Eucharistic feast that stood at the center of Christian worship. On the other hand, the Church was deeply suspicious of the pleasures of the body, including the pleasure of eating, and it deployed fasting, the deliberate restriction or elimination of certain foods on certain days, as a primary instrument of spiritual discipline, a way of asserting the soul's dominance over the body's appetites and aligning the individual Christian with the suffering of Christ and the sacrifices of the saints. The practical consequence of this theological framework was a calendar of extraordinary complexity, in which a significant portion of every year was designated as fasting time, during which specific foods, primarily meat, were prohibited. The numbers, when you add them up, are genuinely striking. Fridays were fast days in commemoration of the crucifixion. Saturdays were fast days in many traditions, in honor of the Virgin. Wednesdays were fast days in some observances. The 40 days of Lent before Easter were the great sustained fast of the Christian year, during which meat was prohibited and dietary restriction was expected to be serious and consistent. The Advent season before Christmas carried its own fasting obligations. The vigils before major feast days required fasting the day before the celebration. The Ember Days, 4 sets of 3 days scattered through the year at the change of seasons, were fasting days. Add all of this up, and you arrive at a number that historians have calculated at somewhere between 150 and 200 days per year on which meat was prohibited for observant medieval Christians. That is roughly half the year. Half the year without meat, in a world that already ate relatively little of it. The word fasting here requires some careful unpacking, because it did not mean, in the medieval context, what it most commonly means today. Modern fasting typically implies eating nothing, or eating as little as possible, for a defined period. Medieval fasting meant eating no meat, and depending on the strictness of the observance and the wealth of the faster, it might also mean eating no animal products at all, including eggs and dairy, particularly during Lent. What you could eat on a fast day was fish, vegetables, legumes, bread, fruit, and oil. What you could not eat was the flesh of warm-blooded animals. This distinction between fish and meat was the central organizing principle of the medieval fasting system, and it produced some of the most interesting and sometimes most absurd moments in medieval food history, because the boundary between fish and not fish was a theological question as much as a biological one, and theological questions, as we have already seen with the beaver tale, were susceptible to creative interpretation. Fish, then, was the great fast day food, and the medieval fish trade was an enormous, economically significant industry built almost entirely on religious obligation. Without the fasting calendar, there would have been far less demand for fish. With it, fish, particularly preserved fish that could be transported inland, became one of the most important commodities in medieval Europe. Herring, caught in vast quantities in the North Sea and the Baltic, was salted and dried and barreled and shipped across the continent in quantities that are still impressive when you look at the historical trade records. Stockfish, dried cod, hard as a board, requiring prolonged soaking and beating before it became edible, was the fast-day staple of populations far from the sea, available in every market town and consumed by people who had never seen the ocean and could not quite imagine what a fresh fish looked like. Freshwater fish from rivers and managed fish ponds, carp, pike, perch, bream, eel, supplemented the preserved sea fish for those with access to them, and the great monasteries and noble estates maintained elaborate systems of fish ponds specifically to ensure a reliable supply of acceptable fast-day protein. Monasteries, in particular, developed an extraordinarily sophisticated fish cuisine over the centuries, driven partly by genuine culinary creativity and partly by the necessity of making an essentially limited ingredient interesting across 150 or more days of obligation per year. Monastic fish cookery included dishes of genuine elegance: pike stuffed with herbs and poached in wine, carp baked in a spice sauce, eels stewed with leeks and ginger, that represent a serious and sustained engagement with the possibilities of a constrained ingredient palette. The monks had time, resources, educated cooks, and a very powerful motivation to make fasting food as good as it could possibly be, and in many cases they succeeded admirably. For ordinary people without access to monastic kitchens or fish ponds, fast days meant a considerably more austere table. Salt herring, reconstituted from its preserved state and boiled or fried, was the fast-day meal of the medieval masses, nutritious enough, certainly, but possessed of a flavor and texture that no amount of culinary creativity entirely redeemed, and consumed with a frequency that must have made Friday a day regarded with mixed feelings at best. The smell of salt herring cooking in a small, poorly ventilated cottage is not, by most accounts, a smell that improves with repeated exposure. Medieval people ate it anyway because the alternative was sin, and sin had consequences that extended well beyond the immediate culinary experience. Now, here is where the story gets genuinely interesting because medieval people were creative and medieval people were hungry, and the combination of creativity and hunger applied to a theological system produced a remarkable flowering of what we might politely call loophole cuisine. We have already met the beaver tail, classified as fish. We have met the barnacle goose, hatched from the sea and therefore not quite meat. The list of similar creative reclassifications is long and entertaining and says a great deal about the human capacity to find technically compliant ways around rules that are inconveniently restrictive. Puffins were classified as fish in some regions, on the grounds that they spent most of their time at sea and tasted somewhat fishy. Capybara, the large South American rodent, was classified as fish by Venezuelan bishops after the Spanish conquest, because it lived in and around water and was aquatic enough in its habits to qualify for Lenten consumption. This is a post-medieval example, but it belongs to exactly the same tradition of motivated taxonomic reasoning. Closer to home and closer to the medieval period proper, the question of eggs and dairy during Lent was handled differently in different regions and different centuries. Officially prohibited in strict observance, tacitly permitted in many places because the alternative was genuine nutritional hardship for populations that relied heavily on eggs and dairy for protein throughout the year. Historians still argue about how rigorously ordinary medieval people actually observed the fasting regulations, and the evidence is mixed enough to support a range of conclusions. Church records, penitential manuals, and the accounts of moralists and preachers suggest that violations were common, that enforcement was inconsistent, and that the gap between official requirement and everyday practice was significant and persistent. Archaeological evidence from medieval rubbish deposits, the bones, seeds, and food remains that archaeologists sift from medieval middens, sometimes shows meat consumption patterns on fast days that suggest either casual disregard for the rules or selective enforcement by local clergy who were themselves not always models of strict observance. At the same time, the fish trade data, the fish pond records, and the surviving recipe manuscripts all testify to a world in which fasting food was taken seriously enough to be worth the considerable commercial and culinary investment required to support it. The wealthy, as in most things, had an easier time with fasting than the poor, and not just because they could afford better fish. The rich could obtain dispensations, official ecclesiastical permissions to eat meat on fast days, for reasons of health, travel, or the demands of military service, and the sale of such dispensations was a modest but real source of income for the church at various points in the medieval period. A lord recovering from illness might receive a physician's recommendation and an episcopal dispensation allowing meat during Lent. A traveler far from home in a place where fish was unavailable might obtain similar accommodation. The paperwork was real and the process was official, but it was also, unmistakably, a system in which money and status made the rules more flexible for those who had them, which is a pattern so consistent across medieval life that it barely qualifies as an observation at this point. The spiritual dimension of fasting was, in the official theology, as important as the physical restriction. Fasting was not just about not eating meat. It was about the interior disposition with which you approached the fast, the humility, the penitence, the deliberate turning of attention from bodily appetite toward spiritual concerns. A rich lord who ate elaborate fish dishes with expensive spices and rare ingredients on fast days was, in the eyes of the more rigorous medieval moralists, not really fasting at all. He was simply rearranging his luxury. The fast was supposed to hurt, gently, in a way that reminded you of your dependence on God and your solidarity with the poor. The elaborate fish banquets of great households, and they were elaborate, as the surviving recipe manuscripts demonstrate, tested this ideal rather severely. The church also controlled food in ways that extended beyond the fasting calendar. The tithe system required that a tenth of agricultural production be rendered to the church, which made the church one of the largest receivers of food in medieval Europe and one of the largest distributors of it as well, since the obligation to feed the poor and the sick fell substantially on ecclesiastical institutions. Monasteries ran hospitals, hospices, and guest houses where travelers and the destitute could receive a meal, and this charitable function was genuine and important, even when the food available was simple. The monastery's obligation to hospitality, the Benedictine rule's injunction to receive every guest as Christ, meant that the gates of great religious houses were regularly open to those who needed feeding, and the kitchens that served the monks also served, in some capacity, the communities around them. There is also the matter of feast days, the holy days of the church calendar that punctuated the fasting periods and provided occasions for legitimate, even obligatory, celebration and good eating. Christmas, Easter, Whitsun, and the feast days of major saints were days on which the normal restrictions were lifted and eating well was not just permitted but encouraged as an expression of gratitude and joy. The contrast between the austerity of a Lenten fast and the abundance of an Easter feast was deliberately cultivated and deeply felt. For communities that had spent 40 days eating salt fish and dried peas, the arrival of Easter morning with its permission to slaughter and roast the animals that had been fattening through the winter was a moment of genuine, almost physical relief, the body's reward for the soul's discipline, the feast that the fast had been building toward all along. The egg, specifically, has an interesting Easter history rooted in the fasting calendar. Eggs laid during Lent, when eggs were officially prohibited in strict observance, accumulated throughout the fast period, hard-boiled to preserve them, and were then available in quantity at Easter as a fresh and welcome protein source after weeks of fish. The custom of giving decorated eggs at Easter, which persists in various forms to the present day, has roots in this practical reality. Eggs were plentiful, they were special after their absence, and decorating them was a way of marking their return to the table as a celebration. The Easter egg is, in this reading, a piece of medieval nutritional history wrapped in a tradition that has survived the context that produced it by several centuries and now sits in chocolate form in a supermarket near you, entirely divorced from its origins in the Lenten fish supply. So the church has been with you all day. It was there when you chose your grain, because the tithe had already taken its portion before you touched the rest. It was there when you sat down to pottage, because the herbs you used were grown in a garden tended partly by monastic knowledge. It was there when you ate or did not eat meat, because the day of the week determined that choice as much as your pantry did. It was there in the spiced wine, which was also medicine, which was also a kind of prayer for bodily health understood as a form of stewardship of God's creation. And it will be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day of your medieval life, at every meal, in every kitchen, presiding over the table with an authority so total and so thoroughly embedded in the daily rhythm of existence that most people do not experience it as external constraint at all. It is simply the shape of time. It is simply how life is organized. It is simply the way that eating works, in a world where the sacred and the physical have not yet been sorted into separate rooms. The fast days are behind you and the feast days are behind you and the pottage is behind you, and now we need to talk about something that has been lurking at the edges of this entire conversation like a shadow you keep almost seeing in your peripheral vision, the body itself, and what medieval food was doing to it, and whether the people eating all of this bread and pottage and salt fish and spiced wine were, in any meaningful sense, healthy. The answer is complicated in the way that all honest answers about medieval life are complicated, which is to say that it contains both more resilience and more suffering than the simplified version suggests, and that the suffering, when you look at it closely, is specific and traceable and often leads directly back to the plate. Let us begin with the baseline because the baseline is important. The average medieval person was not, contrary to a persistent popular image, a tiny, wizened creature who died at 35 and spent their brief years in a fog of malnutrition and disease. Medieval people could be tall. Skeletal evidence from well-nourished populations in the early medieval period shows average male heights of around 5 feet 7 or 8 inches, comparable to modern European populations, and it was the later medieval period and the early modern period, with their urban crowding and deteriorating diets, that saw a significant decline in average stature that was not fully recovered until the 20th century. People who survived childhood, which was the genuinely dangerous period, could live into their 50s, 60s, and beyond. Medieval cemeteries contain the remains of people who reached quite respectable ages by any standard, their bones worn but intact, their joints arthritic in the way that hard physical labor produces arthritis, but their skeletons telling a story of lives that were long enough to accumulate the evidence of decades. What the skeletons also tell, when examined by modern bioarchaeologists with their isotope analyses and their microscopic examination of bone and dental tissue, is a story of specific, identifiable nutritional deficiencies that corresponded directly to the diet we have been describing. Dental enamel hypoplasia, the disruption of normal enamel formation caused by periods of nutritional stress or illness during childhood, appears with considerable frequency in medieval skeletal populations, its visible horizontal lines across the tooth surface serving as a permanent record of the moments in childhood when the body was not getting what it needed. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, left distinctive bowing of the long bones that archaeologists can identify centuries later. Scurvy, from vitamin C deficiency, shows in changes to bone density and in lesions on the bone surface. Iron deficiency anemia, possibly the most widespread nutritional deficiency in medieval Europe, produced a characteristic pitting of the eye sockets called cribor orbitalia that appears in medieval skeletal populations with a frequency that speaks to how pervasive the condition was. The vitamin C situation deserves particular attention because it illustrates something important about how medieval nutrition worked seasonally. Fresh fruits and vegetables, the primary dietary sources of vitamin C, were available in reasonable quantities during the summer and autumn months, and a medieval person eating well in September, with access to fresh garden produce and orchard fruit, was probably getting adequate vitamin C and would not develop scurvy. The problem came in winter and early spring, the hungry gap that every pre-modern agricultural society experienced. When the summer's fresh produce was long gone, the stored root vegetables were running low, and fresh green things had not yet appeared. It was in these months, February, March, April, that the cumulative effects of a vitamin C-depleted winter diet began to manifest as weakness, joint pain, bleeding gums, and the other symptoms that medieval people described under various names without understanding the underlying cause. The spring arrival of nettles, dandelion greens, and other early wild plants was medically as well as culinarily significant. These early greens provided a burst of vitamin C at exactly the moment when the body's reserves were most depleted. Iron deficiency was partly a consequence of the diet's heavy reliance on grain and legumes, which contain iron but in a form that is less bioavailable than the iron in meat, and which also contain phytates, compounds that bind to minerals and reduce their absorption. A diet consisting primarily of bread and pottage with minimal meat and without the vitamin C that enhances iron absorption was a diet that consistently underdelivered on iron relative to the body's needs, particularly for women of reproductive age whose iron requirements are higher. The archaeological evidence for anemia in medieval women is striking, and the medieval medical literature's frequent descriptions of pale, weak, breathless women and its recommendations of iron-rich foods and red wine as treatments represent an empirically grounded observation. However wrong the theoretical framework explaining it might have been. The grain itself, beyond the ergot problem we encountered in the first section, carried another nutritional complication that affected large populations: pellagra. Pellagra is a disease caused by niacin deficiency, and it occurs in populations that rely heavily on maize, which became a major issue in Europe after the Columbian Exchange introduced American crops, but also, in a different form, in populations heavily dependent on other grains processed in ways that make the niacin they contain biologically inaccessible. Medieval populations eating enormous quantities of poorly processed grain were at risk of subclinical niacin deficiency that expressed itself as fatigue, skin problems, and cognitive impairment without necessarily producing the full clinical picture of pellagra, making it one of those quiet, background deficiencies that degraded quality of life without leaving a dramatic diagnostic footprint. The relationship between food and disease in the medieval world was intimate and constant, and the mechanisms ran in both directions. Poor nutrition made people more vulnerable to infectious disease, and infectious disease made people less able to absorb and utilize the nutrition they did consume. The medieval world was extraordinarily rich in infectious disease. The reasons were structural and largely food-related. Animals and humans lived in close proximity, facilitating zoonotic disease transmission. Food storage was imperfect, creating opportunities for fungal and bacterial contamination. Water sources were frequently contaminated, as we have discussed. Markets brought together people and animals from different regions, mixing disease pools that might otherwise remain separate. And the nutritional status of the population, chronically compromised by the diet we have been describing, meant that when infectious disease arrived, the immune response it encountered was often impaired in ways that made outcomes worse than they might otherwise have been. The Black Death, the bubonic plague pandemic that struck Europe between 1347 and 1351 and killed somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population, is the most dramatic example of this intersection between disease and nutrition, though it is worth being careful not to reduce the Black Death to a nutritional story. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible, was genuinely catastrophic regardless of the nutritional status of its victims, and the wealthy, who ate better, died alongside the poor in sufficient numbers to make clear that no diet could protect against it. But the population that the plague struck in 1347 was one that had been weakened by the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 and its aftermath. A generation of inadequate nutrition, disrupted agriculture, and accumulated physical stress that may have left immune systems less robust than they would otherwise have been, and that had already reduced the population of some regions by 10 to 25% before the plague even arrived. The 14th century was, nutritionally and epidemiologically, one of the worst centuries in European history, and food, its absence, its inadequacy, its contamination, was at the center of that catastrophe. Historians still argue about the precise relationship between the Great Famine and the Black Death, whether the famine-weakened population was significantly more vulnerable to the plague than a better-nourished one would have been, or whether the plague was so virulent that nutritional status made relatively little difference to its mortality rate. The evidence cuts both ways, and the interaction between malnutrition and immune function is complex enough that confident conclusions remain elusive. What is not in doubt is that the two catastrophes together reshaped European society in ways that took generations to fully work through. There is a darker culinary footnote to the famine years that belongs here, spoken quietly and without dwelling, because it is part of the honest record. Contemporary chronicles from the Great Famine period describe people eating things that were not food: grass, tree bark, leather, the bodies of the dead. These are accounts written by literate, educated observers who had no reason to invent them, and they appear in the records of multiple countries and multiple decades, a consistent thread of documentation that speaks to extremity so complete that the ordinary categories of edible and inedible ceased to function. Medieval people were not indifferent to this horror. Their chronicles record it with grief and shock. But they also record it as fact, matter-of-factly alongside the prices of grain and the movements of armies, because in the medieval chronicler's world, All of these things were equally real and equally part of the human story. On a less catastrophic scale, food poisoning was a constant and significant feature of medieval life, though medieval people did not have a framework for understanding it as such. The symptoms of bacterial food poisoning, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, cramps, were attributed to a range of causes including divine punishment, demonic interference, humoral imbalance, and the malign influence of specific foods in specific combinations, without anyone identifying the actual mechanism. The concept of contamination in the sense we understand it, specific microorganisms multiplying in improperly stored food and producing toxins, was entirely absent from medieval medical thinking. What medieval physicians did know, empirically if not mechanistically, was that certain foods in certain conditions were more likely to make people ill. Meat that smelled wrong, grain that had been stored wet, fish that was insufficiently preserved. The practical knowledge existed even without the theoretical framework, and medieval household management texts devote considerable attention to the proper storage and handling of food in ways that represent genuine, if theoretically misunderstood, food safety practice. The cookbook and household management tradition also reflects a preoccupation with the health properties of food that goes beyond simple nutrition. Recipes in medieval manuscripts are frequently accompanied by notes about which humoral types the dish is appropriate for, which ailments it might help or harm, and what season it is best suited to. Cooking was understood as a form of medicine, and the medieval cook, at least in a sophisticated household with access to learned advice, was expected to understand the dietary properties of ingredients and to compose meals that supported the health of the diners according to their individual constitutions. A young, hot-tempered man of sanguine temperament needed different food from an elderly, cold, phlegmatic one. A woman in pregnancy had specific dietary requirements. A convalescent recovering from fever needed light, easily digestible foods that would not tax a weakened digestive system. All of this was real medical advice, given seriously by educated physicians, and the degree to which it helped or harmed varied considerably by specific recommendation. Some of it was genuinely sensible, some of it was actively counterproductive, and most of it was somewhere in the vast middle ground of probably not making a significant difference either way. The teeth, which we visited briefly in the first section, tell their own long story about the effects of medieval food on the body. Medieval dental pathology, as revealed by skeletal analysis, is both better and worse than you might expect. Caries, tooth decay from sugar, was less common in ordinary people than in modern populations, because sugar was expensive and rare in the diet of most people. What medieval people suffered from instead was extraordinary dental wear from the grit and coarseness of their diet, periodontal disease from the bacterial environment of the pre-toothbrush mouth, and the specific, identifiable pattern of wear produced by using the teeth as tools, holding rope or leather while working with the hands, cracking nuts, processing sinew, that suggests a relationship with the mouth as a practical instrument quite different from the modern one. Dental treatment in the medieval period was limited and often brutal. Tooth extraction was performed by barbers and traveling tooth pullers using instruments and techniques that prioritized speed over comfort, because speed was the closest available substitute for anesthesia. Oil of cloves, which contains eugenol, a genuine analgesic, was sometimes applied to reduce pain, and this is one of those medieval medical practices that turns out to have genuine pharmacological basis. Clove oil is still used in dentistry today, in a more refined form, for exactly the same purpose. The medieval tooth puller who packed a painful cavity with clove oil before extraction was providing real, if incomplete, relief through a mechanism they could not have explained but that centuries of practical observation had identified as useful. So the medieval body, fed on this diet, worked hard and wore out along characteristic lines. The peasant skeleton shows the effects of heavy agricultural labor, joint degeneration, muscle attachment sites enlarged by years of pulling and lifting and digging, spinal compression from carrying heavy loads. Alongside these mechanical signatures are the nutritional ones, the enamel defects, the anemia markers, the vitamin deficiency evidence. Taken together, they describe a body that was capable of extraordinary work and that aged quickly under the weight of it, that was resilient in some ways and fragile in others, and that navigated a world in which the distance between adequate nourishment and dangerous deficiency was uncomfortably short and crossed with uncomfortable frequency. And yet, and this is the note on which this section should probably end, because it is the truest thing, medieval people were not simply victims of their diet. They were active, creative, resourceful agents in their own nutritional fate, doing the best they could with what they had, using the knowledge available to them, finding the loopholes and the workarounds and the seasonal bonuses that made the difference between getting by and getting through. The forager who knew which spring plants restored health after a long winter was practicing nutritional medicine without a name for it. The cook who preserved the maximum nutrition in the minimum fuel by keeping the pottage simmering was an efficiency expert without a degree. The community that shared its resources in the lean months was running a mutual aid network without a charter. The diet was inadequate by modern standards. The people living on it were not. The body has told its story, and the bones have given up their quiet evidence, and now we arrive at the last long stretch of this particular journey through the medieval world, the place where food and endings meet, where the table is set for the last time, where the pottage goes cold and the bread is broken for the final occasion, and where the rituals that surrounded eating in life extended, with remarkable tenderness and specificity, into the territory of dying and death. This is not a morbid destination. It is, in its way, one of the most human corners of the entire medieval food story, because the care that medieval people brought to feeding the dying and the dead tells you more about their relationship with food, with community, and with each other than almost anything else we have examined tonight. Let us begin where the medieval imagination began when it thought about food and death, which is with the concept of the deathbed itself and the specific, medically and spiritually charged question of what a dying person should eat. Medieval medicine had very precise views on this subject, rooted as always in humoral theory but inflected with a pastoral concern for the spiritual state of the patient that gave dietary advice at the end of life a dimension that went beyond the purely physical. The dying body, in the medieval medical understanding, was a body in which the vital heat was failing. The inner warmth that animated life was guttering like a candle in a draught. And the role of food in this context was to support and prolong that warmth without overtaxing a system that no longer had the strength to process heavy or demanding ingredients. What this meant in practice was a deathbed diet of extraordinary simplicity and lightness. Thin broths, possets made from warm ale or wine curdled with eggs and sweetened with honey or sugar, small amounts of easily digestible bread softened in liquid, herbal teas made from calming and warming plants like chamomile and lemon balm. The almond, which was prized throughout medieval medicine for its combination of nutritive value and gentle digestibility, appeared frequently in deathbed recipes in the form of almond milk. Ground almonds stirred into water or broth to create a smooth, pale liquid that could be spooned into a patient who could no longer manage solid food. Almond milk was the great medical food of the medieval sickroom, recommended for fevers, for weakness, for convalescence, and for dying, and it appears in medical texts, household accounts, and recipe manuscripts with a frequency that reflects both its genuine palatability and its status as the most medically respectable food available for a compromised constitution. The giving of food to the dying was not just a medical act. It was a profoundly relational one, and the medieval literature of dying, the Ars Moriendi tradition, the art of dying well, recognized this without quite saying it explicitly. To sit beside a dying person and offer them something warm, something sweet, something made with care, was to enact in miniature the entire web of obligation and affection that bound medieval communities together. The woman who carried a posset of warm ale and honey to her dying neighbor was doing what neighbors did. In a world without hospitals, without professional end-of-life care, without any institution capable of absorbing the work of caring for the dying except the community itself. Food was one of the primary languages in which that care was expressed, and at the end of life, as at every other point in medieval existence, it spoke volumes. The Church had its own food for the dying, and it was the most important food of all, the Eucharist, the consecrated host brought to the bedside of the dying as part of the last rites, the final reception of communion before death. The theology of the Viaticum, the Eucharist given as food for the journey of death, was specific and rich. The word viaticum means provision for a journey, the food you take with you when you travel, and its application to the last communion expressed the medieval understanding of death not as an ending but as a transition, a departure for which the dying person needed to be provisioned as carefully as any traveler preparing for a long road. The consecrated bread, given with anointing and absolution, was the last meal that truly mattered, the one that the whole elaborate structure of the medieval food world, the daily bread, the feast, the fast, the pottage, the spice, the ale, had been, in some theological sense, pointing toward all along. Beyond the deathbed itself, food played a central role in the rituals that surrounded death in the broader community. The funeral feast, the meal shared by family, friends, and neighbors after a burial, was a universal feature of medieval commemorative culture, and it served several functions simultaneously. It fed people who had traveled to attend the funeral and might have come some distance. It demonstrated the family's ability to provide hospitality even in grief, which was a social statement about their status and their resources. It created a communal gathering in which the dead person's life could be remembered, their virtues praised, and the community's solidarity with the bereaved expressed through the shared act of eating and drinking together. And it provided, for the bereaved themselves, the practical comfort of food prepared by others at a time when the capacity to cook for oneself might be genuinely impaired by grief. The foods served at funeral feasts were generally the best the family could afford, which varied enormously by social position. A noble funeral might involve feasting on a scale comparable to a wedding, with multiple courses, imported wine, and significant expenditure that was understood as a final statement of the dead person's status and the family's ongoing dignity. A peasant funeral might involve shared bread and ale and whatever could be quickly assembled from the contributions of neighbors, modest in quantity but no less genuine in its intention. The tradition of bringing food to a bereaved family, which persists in many cultures to this day, that instinct to arrive at the door of a grieving household with something cooked, has its roots in exactly this medieval practice of communal provision for the dead and the living simultaneously. There was also the matter of food given specifically for the soul of the dead, alms distributed at the funeral gate to the poor, who were expected to pray for the deceased in exchange for the bread or ale they received. This was not charity in the modern sense, or not only charity. It was a transaction with a spiritual dimension, in which the prayers of the poor were understood to have genuine efficacy in shortening the time the deceased soul spent in purgatory, the intermediate state of purification that medieval Catholic theology placed between death and heaven. To feed the poor at your funeral was to purchase prayers with bread, and the poor who gathered at the gates of churches on burial days were as much participants in a spiritual economy as recipients of material generosity. The wealthy left careful instructions in their wills about how many poor should be fed, with what food, for how many days after their death, calculating the return on their investment in prayers with the same attention to detail they brought to their secular commercial transactions. Chantries, endowed chapels or altars at which priests were paid to sing masses for the souls of the dead in perpetuity, were sometimes accompanied by provisions for ongoing feeding of the poor, establishing a permanent link between the dead person's name and the act of nourishing the living. Some wealthy medieval individuals left endowments for anniversary feasts, annual meals provided on the anniversary of their death, at which their memory was formally kept alive through the communal act of eating together. The dole cupboard, a carved wooden cabinet found in some medieval English churches, was used to distribute bread to the poor after services, and its presence in the church building was a permanent reminder of the obligation to feed that the institution and its patrons had accepted as part of the community of the living and the dead. The food that appeared in medieval depictions of the afterlife is also worth a moment's attention, because it tells you something about what medieval people imagined a better existence to look like. And the answer is, unsurprisingly, given everything we have explored tonight, an existence in which food was abundant, effortless, and perpetually available. The land of Cockaigne, a medieval folk fantasy that appears in poetry and visual art across several European cultures, described an imaginary paradise where roasted animals wandered about offering themselves to be eaten, where rivers ran with wine, where cooked fish leaped from streams onto the bank, where houses were built from cake and their roofs thatched with pastry. It was, in its essence, the inverse of the medieval peasant's actual experience, a world in which no one was ever hungry, no one had to work for their food, and abundance was the natural and permanent state of things. The specificity of the fantasy, the roasted animals, the rivers of wine, the pastry roofs, reflects with perfect fidelity the specific anxieties and desires of people for whom scarcity was the daily reality. You dream about what you lack, and medieval people dreamed about food. The monastic tradition produced its own vision of food and eternity, more theologically sophisticated than Cockaigne but resting on the same deep human longing. The heavenly banquet, the messianic feast described in scripture and elaborated by medieval theologians. Imagine the blessed gathered at a divine table, fed by God himself, in a feast that was eternal and perfect and required no labor or preparation. The Eucharistic theology that identified the Mass with this heavenly banquet gave every communion service a connection to the ultimate meal, and the bread of the Eucharist was understood not just as a memorial of the Last Supper but as a foretaste of the eschatological feast, a small, literal sample of eternity available in the present moment through faith and sacrament. This is a remarkable thing to think about while eating bread, that this simple, humble, gritty, tooth-wearing substance is, in the right theological context, a door into something infinite and perfect. Medieval people thought about it every Sunday, and many of them thought about it every day. The last meal of a condemned prisoner is a custom that has medieval roots, though its exact origins are debated. The idea that a person about to die should be given a final good meal before execution reflects both practical mercy and the same theological logic as the deathbed diet and the viaticum. The journey ahead requires provisioning, the body deserves a final comfort, and the community's obligation to the individual persists even at the moment of its most severe exercise of power over them. Medieval execution records and chronicles occasionally mention food given to the condemned before death, though the practice was inconsistent and depended heavily on the mercy of the jailer and the resources available. The modern custom of the last meal request, in which a condemned prisoner can specify what they wish to eat, is a surprisingly recent formalization of a much older intuition about the relationship between food, dignity, and the end of life. Historians still argue about the degree to which medieval people had a coherent, conscious philosophy of food that connected the daily bread with the deathbed posset with the funeral feast with the Eucharistic host, whether medieval food culture was as theologically integrated as the most sophisticated theological texts suggest, or whether most people simply ate what they could get and performed the required rituals without the interior dimension that the literate elite attributed to them. The honest answer is probably both, in the way that most human experience is both conscious and unreflective, both meaningful and mechanical, both rich with significance and simply hungry, simply tired, simply reaching for the bowl because it is there and it is warm and it is enough. And that, in the end, is what this entire long evening of medieval eating has been about. The bowl that is warm and the bread that is gritty and the pot that never quite empties and the feast that blazes up against the dark and the fast that carves out space in the calendar for something other than appetite. And all of it held together by the simple, profound, indestructible human fact of hunger and the equally simple, equally profound, equally indestructible human fact of feeding each other. And now, let the medieval world recede gently, like a fire burning down to its embers in the small hours of the morning. Let the noise of the great hall grow quiet, the music fading, the torches one by one guttering out. Let the cottage hearth cool slowly, the pottage pot settling into stillness, the bread wrapped in cloth for tomorrow. Let the smell of wood smoke and thyme and spiced wine soften and dissolve, and let the dark fields outside the village wall rest under whatever sky is overhead tonight, stars or cloud or the first pale suggestion of a dawn that is still hours away. You have traveled a long way through a world that was harder and stranger and richer and more human than you might have expected, and you have earned the rest that is waiting for you now. The medieval people whose plates and pots and pantries you have been peering into tonight would not have understood your world any better than you understand theirs, but they would have recognized the hunger and the warmth and the comfort of a meal shared in good company, and they would have understood, without needing it explained, why someone might want to lie down at the end of a long day and let a quiet voice tell them about something distant and strange and somehow familiar. Let your breathing slow now. Let your shoulders settle. Let the last of the evening's images drift and soften. The peacock in its feathers, the gritty bread, the perpetual pot, the small warm comfort dissolving on a medieval tongue somewhere in the candlelit dark of a world that is gone and is not gone, because we carry it with us in every loaf we bake, every soup we set to simmer, every meal we make for someone we love when they are tired or cold or at the end of something difficult. The fire is low. The pot is quiet. The bread will keep until morning. Sleep now and let it all be still.